Hey everyone, today I have a sewing tutorial for you. Around 2 weeks ago I shared the top that I made in sewing class. That's very similar to this one, but it has a button closure to create these openings. A lot of you showed interest in me explaining how I did it, so this tutorial is for those of you who are interested. I'm showing you two ways of creating these openings in this tutorial. One is with the button closure like the original one, and this one is without buttons. This one is definitely the easiest out of the two, but I personally like the button closure better. I think it adds some interest to the design. But this is also a very plain fabric. I think that if this adds some pattern or a more interesting color, I think it's also a cool design. So I'm going to show you how to do those two. And for this tutorial, you're going to need the Bodice blog for knit fabrics, or you can just use a pattern for a tight fitting top. I asked on Instagram for recommendations for free patterns for tight fitting tops, so if you don't already have one, I'm going to leave them all in the description and you can get whichever one you prefer. For this design, we only need to alter the front pattern piece. The back and the sleeves will remain the same. And as the front of this design is asymmetrical, you need to have a complete front pattern piece to be able to alter the pattern. So you're going to grab a folded sheet of paper and you're going to place the front pattern piece on top of it along the fold line. Now you just need to trace the pattern all around. You're going to cut along the pattern you traced. And when you open the sheet of paper, you have a complete front pattern piece that we're now going to alter. I personally want the opening to go from my shoulder until the bottom of the top while going through the center of my bust, so the first thing I did was finding out where the center of my bust was, and then I connected it to the other 2 points. And you can change the location of the opening depending on the style you're going for. Now that you figure out the line where your opening will be, you're going to cut along that line, and now you have 2 different pattern pieces that form the front of your top. Now we need to add the seam allowance to both sides. I like to use 1 cm seam allowance, but you can adapt this to your preference. This is the last change we need to do to the pattern. The front has 2 layers, so the hem in the front is sewn by sewing the 2 layers right sides facing, while the back is hemmed as you normally would by folding the edge and top stitching. So you need to change the hem at the front to the same seam allowance you used in the front seam, and mine is again 1 cm. Now you just need to mark your button placement. Remember that the gap between each button will dictate how wide your openings will be. For reference, I marked a distance of 4 cm between each button because I didn't want my openings to be too wide. You need to cut 2 of each side of the front pattern pieces, and the remaining is the same: 2 sleeves, 1 back, and a piece of fabric to finish the neckline, if that's how you want to finish your neckline. I'm making my top in a mesh fabric, so I'm cutting the inner layers of the front in a more opaque fabric, but if you're using a fabric that doesn't need any special treatment, you can just use the same fabric for the outside and the inner layer of the front. Now you're going to apply a strip of stretch interfacing to the seam of the front pattern pieces. You don't need to apply it to both the inner and outer layer. I found that just 1 layer of interfacing on each side gave it enough strength. On the first version I used regular elastic to sew the loops, but I found that it was hard to secure the elastic to the fabric because the needle couldn't go through the elastic. This time I'm going to use this trimming, but I'm removing some loops to create that opening effect. Now you need to pin the trimming to the right side of one of the front pattern pieces, and the side doesn't really matter. Just make sure that the loops are turned towards the inside and not the outside of the seam. If you decide to create the loops with elastic, you just need to cut little strips of elastic and pin them to each marking along the pattern piece. Paste the trimming or the elastic loops to the fabric. Now you're going to place the matching front pattern pieces right sides facing and sew the center front seam. Just make sure that the trimming tape is inside the seam so that you can only see the loops on the outside. If you want to make the version without buttons, you need to cut both front pattern pieces on the fold. Your pattern piece might have a curved line, but try to place it on the fold as straight as you can. Now press the fold so that it's visible, and you can match the fold on both pieces by pinning everything in place. Now just mark the placement where the buttons would go along that fold line and sew over those markings. Once you open the front, you now have these openings which mimic the look of the original design, which created those openings with the buttons. Now the rest of the construction is the same on both versions. Now you're going to secure both front pieces at the shoulder by stitching them together, lay the front and back right sides facing, and sew just one of the shoulder seams. I like to leave the neckline open just because I find it easier to finish the neckline this way. To finish the neckline, I'm just using a folded strip of fabric like you would finish the neckline on a t-shirt. Now we're going to close the remaining shoulder seam. Here I'm showing you the pieces wrong sides facing, but I've sewn them right sides facing, so just keep that in mind. I personally like to hem the sleeves and all that while the fabric is flat. It's how I've been doing it lately and I just find it easier. If you prefer to hem them last, you can do that, but the back does have to be hemmed at this point. The front is closed by turning the pieces right sides facing and sewing along the bottom edge. Just remember to fold the seam allowance. You also have to keep in mind the bottom button loop, because you have to sew just beneath the bottom loop so that you don't catch it in the seam. The side seams on this top are sewn using the burrito method, so basically you cannot see the seam allowance both on the inside and outside of the top. I always have a hard time explaining how the burrito method works, but I think the video is pretty self-explanatory, so you just need to do the same on both sides. going to lay the sleeves right sides facing and sew them closed. And now it's time to attach them to the body. You just have to ease in the sleeves and sew them following the notches that you have in your pattern. This is probably the most time-consuming part of this top. You're going to mark the button placement using the button loops as a guide, and then you're going to sew them. To finish the top, you just need to fold the seam allowances while catching the serger tail in the fold and then top stitching it so that the tail of the serger is secured between the seam allowance and the stitching. And you're going to do this to both the sleeves and the neckline. And this is how the tops turned out. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and if you end up making one of these asymmetrical cutout tops button, whatever AliExpress description fits the top, I would love to see how it turns out, so don't forget to tag me. Bye!